Welcome to the Calvary Road with Pastor Sam Allen.
What's happening in the lives of people who are just watching us and listening to us, and when everything's falling apart and we're like, man, I know the Lord's for me. I know the Lord loves me. And they're like, how do you know that? Your whole life's a mess. I know it because he says it. And it has more weight when things are going, well, poorly, when our life is difficult, than when everything's just going smooth.
Only with Jesus, only with you.
On today's walk down the Calvary Road, we continue on in this series, Jesus, from Genesis to Revelation, with the title of our study today being Our Kinsman Redeemer, a study and overview of the book of Ruth.
The book of Ruth is the story of a family. It's a story of loss and love. It's a story of suffering and redemption. And it's one that challenges us to take seriously God's exhortation and promise to us that all things work together for good to those who are the called according to his purposes. Why? Because there are so many things in our lives that we can't really see. How is this good? And it doesn't say all things are good. It says they work together for good. That's a radical difference, is it not? So many things that I can't understand, that I can't really comprehend. How can this happen? Why would you let that happen? How do we find ourselves in this situation? Man, we go through Ruth, it's going to get clearer because we're looking at a family living at a time very much like ours. The timing is interesting. It says that all this went down there in verse 1, by the way. It came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So this is the same time we studied last time, when every man did what was right in his own eyes. Huge issue. No king in Israel because, well, God is king and was ruling over his people directly. He gave them his law. He gave them a temple. He gave them a tabernacle, later a temple, feast, festivals, all these things. But the idea was they were going to connect with him, hear from him, walk in fellowship with him. So their season, this season, and it's about a 300 to 350 year season in Israel, post inheriting their inheritance, where they just did what they wanted, where they disregarded God's will for their lives. Well, it's that season, you see, every man doing what's right in his own eyes. And we read there in verse 1 as we continue, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went down to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Get this, Bethlehem, it's the house of bread. And because there's a famine, he's leaving the house of bread and taking his family to Moab. Moabites, by the way, were descendants of Lot through an incestuous relationship with his daughter. And so it's not exactly the culture you want to raise your kids in. But then again, in Israel, everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. Maybe he thought it couldn't be any worse over there in Moab. To me, it's like moving your family from Orange County to Las Vegas. There's a huge difference. And they're going there and doing this because there was a famine in the land. Well, the name of the man was Elimelech. His name means, my God is king. I like that. No king in Israel, but every time someone saw Elimelech, they said, hey, my God is king. And he'd go right on, because that's what his name meant. I love that kind of stuff. We'll see a couple that don't work out as well in a moment, though. His wife was Naomi. Her name means pleasant. So if you met this couple, you would be meeting my God is king and pleasant. I like that so far. The names of his 2 sons, however, were Mahlon, which means sickly, and Kilion, which means pining. So you meet him, my God is king, pleasant, and here's our boy, sickly and pining. I don't really understand that, I have to say, because they named their kids prophetically. You know, we weren't even Christians when we named our first son. We named him Nathan John Allen. And at least the first two are biblical names. Nathan John. It's a huge thing. Of course, people say, well, how did you pick the name Nathan if you weren't Christians? We were actually naming him after Nat King Cole. And so, but nevertheless, well, why didn't you just name him Nat? It's easy. We didn't want kids to bug him at school. And so it's the point is, we name our kids prophetically. We name them based on what's going on. You'll remember when Esau was born. He came out all hairy, so they said, I know, let's call him Harry. It just made sense. Well, I don't know why one of these was sickly and why the other was pining, but that's kind of a sad situation. Well, they were Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Verse 3, we read, then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left in her two sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the other was Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Now, of course, this was forbidden. You're not supposed to marry outside of the Israeli culture and the Israeli people. They needed to marry. They can marry within tribes, but they were supposed to marry someone with the same faith-based understanding of who God was and what he required. And so, of course, these guys don't have a lot of choice because dad has chosen to bring them to Moab. And so whatever else is in play, they marry Moabite women. Now, we read they dwelt there about 10 years, and in verse 5, then Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman survived her two sons and her husband. Before we go any further, let me just say Jesus is everywhere in this story. And I may forget to point out, here's a connecting point. Here's where you can see a type or an Old Testament picture of our Lord and Savior Jesus. But I'll give you 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 as we go through. And then I encourage you to go back and read, since there's only 4 chapters. You'll have whatever we cover today as a foundation. And then just look for Jesus and pray for God to open your eyes and show you Jesus as you read the story again. Well, no king in Israel. Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He didn't become King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He was, is, and will always be who he is. Not just that, when they're leaving Bethlehem, the house of bread, well, Jesus is the bread of life. Well, they leave the house of bread to head to Moab because there's a famine in the land. Listen to Amos 8:11 and see if this doesn't strike a chord. Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord God, that I will send a famine on the land, not a famine of bread, nor a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of God. I see that that's happening there, and I see that that's happening here. In our day, in our generation, while the Bible has never been more accessible to us and more relatable, as there are multiple translations, and it's inconceivable in some ways that we would pay so little attention. Now, I'm not pointing a finger and saying you're not reading it or you're not in it. You're here. So I think they call this preaching to the choir in churches where they have a choir. By the way, this would be preaching to the choir, because here at Calvary, we're leading. You're the choir and God's the audience. It's not like, these guys, although if it's a very small choir, but beautiful to worship leaders today, yeah? So, but my point is, yeah, you could do that. You're not doing it for me, so it's all good. And they still get their treasure in heaven, and they'll probably even be embarrassed that you're clapping. But anyway, here's the point. We don't see ourselves as the leaders, the worshipers, and you an audience. No, you're a congregation of God's people, a called out, separated people by him and for him. And the primary goal of a Christian should be to worship God in spirit and in truth, and then to represent him as we learn what he's like in his holy word. Well, the days are coming, he says, of famine, not of bread or water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. Well, Eli and his family of four, I call him Eli because Elimelech's a lot to say, right? Elimelech. It's 4 syllables. Elijah, our first grandson, we started calling him Eli. We're all the way down to E. I don't think we can shorten it anymore. So if I call him Eli, just understand it's not a nickname. It's just an abbreviation. Eli and his family of 4 left Bethlehem. They head to Moab. Eli dies. The boys marry Moabites. 10 years pass and they die. And it looks like everything has gone wrong. She left, Naomi did, with a husband and 2 boys. Then she has her growing family and no doubt an expectation. Hey, kids soon, grandkids on the horizon. Her husband's dead. Her sons are dead. She has 2 daughter-in-laws. But it appears that everything's gone wrong. And I want to assure you, when it feels like or seems like everything's gone wrong for you, in your family, or in your health, or in your finances, or in your mental or emotional state, or whatever it might be, because we're all tried in so many ways. And we all suffer in so many ways. Well, listen, the scriptures tell us this: God brings beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the spirit of praise for the spirit of heaviness. And here's why that's so important. It appears like everything's gone wrong, but there's something in play that we could never have imagined. And certainly Naomi isn't putting this together yet. She's not thinking, well, I know all things work together for good, because it will be hundreds of years before Paul pins that. No, she doesn't know what's happening or why it's all happened to her, and she is really struggling. Now, we saw in the book of Joshua that prior to the taking of Jericho, 2 spies were sent into the city. I'd suggest they were sent in on a rescue mission. Why? Because there was nothing that they saw or learned or did that could alter God's miraculous battle plan in the first place. I mean, the plan is march around for 7 days and the walls are going to fall down. I don't think they discovered any strategy that was going to make that any better. But they did meet a gal named Rahab, and she actually ends up trusting in the Lord and pleading for her family, which they grant to her. She ends up being in the genealogy that we're going to trace down to Ruth, you see. This Moabite woman who also is cursed because she's a Moabite and lives in a culture that's immoral and in every way just a mess. And I'd suggest, just like that, this is another rescue mission. The part she could have never conceived, the part we can't see in our day-to-day existence, is what's happening in the lives of people who are just watching us and listening to us. And when everything's falling apart and we're like, man, I know the Lord's for me. I know the Lord loves me. And they're like, how do you know that? Your whole life's a mess. I know it because he says it. And it has more weight when things are going, well, poorly, when our life is difficult, than when everything's just going smoothly. Well, Ruth is about to be rescued, is about to be redeemed. So, verse 6 through 15, the 3 widows head out together toward Judah, having heard the famine was over, that the Lord had visited and was blessing his people with bread. Interesting. Bread in the house of bread. It's like going to a bakery. You kind of expect baked goods. But I do appreciate this about them. They didn't change the name of Bethlehem to famine land. They kept it Bethlehem. There was no bread, but they still called it the house of bread. Why? There's an expectation in that, is there not? And so famine, they come and they go. droughts, they come and they go. But in the end, God's always doing something, and more than we could imagine. Well, Naomi had heard, she believed, and by faith arose to head home. She tells her daughter-in-laws, you ought to go back to your own families. Find husbands, bear some kids, and Orpha does. She chooses to go home. But verse 16, take a look. We're going to read a lot together today because we can. And I'm so grateful for that because I prefer to read and teach than to just teach. Well, Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you. It's Ruth 1:16. Entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. And the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. We have Ruth's plea, and we have Ruth's promise. Ruth refuses to leave Naomi. She chooses instead to forsake her land, her family, her idols, to follow Naomi to a new land and a new family and the true and living God. And I love the conclusion there. Don't miss it in verse 17 when she says, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. What she's saying is, I'll be with you until you die, and I'll join you when I die. I love that. I love what we're seeing and reading. Listen, my little brother, Tony, many of you know him. I know some of you support him. Hopefully you're all praying for him and his precious family there in Camden, London. But anyway, years ago, he and his wife decided, having had a daughter, they wanted another child, but they didn't want to just bear one. They wanted to adopt one. And they'd been to China on some missionary trips. And they decided they wanted to adopt a little girl from China. It turned out to be a major process. And you know, of course, that selling or buying a baby is illegal and should be. But you can have a variety of agencies with all sorts of fees and charges and red tape, which in essence cost thousands and thousands of dollars to get a baby that you're just trying to rescue out of poverty. Ruth, his little daughter, Ruthie, was born and placed in an orphanage. It was one of those where there would be like 50 beds in a room. They didn't change children when they cried because they needed to be changed. They changed them on a schedule because there were so many children to change. She was in a situation where she was never handled or touched or played with. They just met the basic and barely basic needs. And it took Tony and his wife months and months and months before they could bring her home. Now, here's the interesting thing. During that time, he being a writer, as we both are, and he's a much better musician, he began to write music for a CD that he put out. It's called 1-1. It's ONEWON, 1-1. And each song on the CD has to do with a part of the story, from the first idea that we should adopt. And then we should adopt in China. And if you listen to the songs, and there are liner notes for them, what happens is you start to see this whole thing come together. They're super moody, moving pieces where they're just struggling emotionally because of all the things that are happening and the difficulty and the doubts that can creep in. Is this even going to ever work? And then there's some very joyful music when you can tell, hey, something good just happened. And they bring her home. All of that to say this. They named her Ruth because they brought her from the east to the west, that their God could be her God and their people could be her people, and that she could live among a people dedicated to and serving the Lord. And they've raised little Ruthie, who's no longer little Ruthie. She's a teen now. her older sister in Bible college. And so the point I'm making is they saw this story and they're like, we could do something like that. You know, we could rescue someone because they saw it. That's what's really going on here more than anything else. Oh, God's going to bless Naomi again. And I doubt that she could have ever envisioned what was ahead in the midst of her suffering and sorrows. Well, last thing, when she says, where you die, I will die, there I'll be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more if anything but death parts you and me. Oh, that husbands today were as committed to their wives as Ruth was to her mother-in-law, Naomi. It's interesting. I grew up in a generation where mother-in-law, there were songs on the radio about it. They weren't exactly saying, yeah, awesome deal, you know. And here's the thing. Ruth sees the Lord in Naomi. That's why she's choosing at this point to say, hey, I'm not leaving your side. I want your people to be my people, and I want to live in the land you live in. I want to be with you, and I will not leave you until death separates us. Well, when she saw, verse 18, that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. It's not saying she gave her the silent treatment. I know you could read it like that. That's why I want to make sure you don't. It's just saying she stopped trying to convince her. She realized stubborn. And I want to say stubbornness is a godly quality. It's only ungodly if we're using it to do something ungodly. But if you can stubbornly stand up for what's right in a society that's got it all wrong, then I applaud your stubbornness. Pam and I were hanging our hat on stubbornness in our early years of marriage. I met her, I was 19, she was 16. We have been together ever since. And when we married, they were saying, this isn't gonna work. My parents had been divorced, her parents had been divorced. And it's, you know, everything was against us. She was a beautiful young girl. I was a stupid hippie. And anyway, the whole thing is we decided when we got married, and people were asking us, so what makes you think you'll be able to make it work? I said, she's the most stubborn person I've ever met. And she would say likewise, yeah, we stubbornly decided nothing will take us apart. No one will take us apart. No one will do us in. We will be together unto death. And that's what she's saying here. I love that. You know, the Lord do to me and more, if anything but death parts you and me. I guess the option would be, you know, no, I'm not going to say that. Pam was here last night, and I was actually foolish enough to say it. I'm like, I guess that means if we're going to be apart sooner, she's going to have to kill me. And then I thought, I really don't want to plant that seed. So when she saw she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. Verse 19 says, now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened when they came to Bethlehem, all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? Now, I don't know how they said, is this Naomi? If it was like, is this really Naomi? Or is this Naomi? Because she definitely has changed. And you'll get to see it, though we can't see her, we can hear her. And you can tell that things are going good or bad or right or wrong often when you listen to people. And so her name is Naomi, which means pleasant. Thank you very much. But she said to them, don't call me pleasant. Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Oh, we remember Mara. They came to the bitter waters and could not drink them as they were wandering through the wilderness because the waters were Mara. The waters were bitter. The waters were polluted. And here she's saying, don't call me pleasant, I'm bitter. Don't call me pleasant, I'm broken. And so the Almighty, she goes on to say, has dealt very bitterly with me. I jotted a couple things in my notes that I think can mar us. And grief can do it. Bitterness can do it. Unforgiveness can do it. Hey, even age can do it. But I want to say, with the exception of age, we don't have to let the others overwhelm us.
We're glad you could join us today on this walk down the Calvary Road. The Calvary Road is a ministry of Calvary Chapel Chico. You can visit our website at ccchico.com or download the CC Chico app to connect with us and to find more from Pastor Sam. You could also listen to the Calvary Road podcast by visiting thecalvaryroad.com. We hope to hear from you, and until next time, may the Lord bless your walk down the Calvary Road.
And your grace